We don't have is towels. I mean, I don't know about you, but my hair is soaking wet, and it would be nice if in the future conference in Vancouver that we have towels to pass out. Otherwise, it's been an absolutely fantastic location and conference. This presidential address, I think, is an important landmark in the history of SRA. I went back through the past presidents, and I pretty much knew all of them and believe that none of them spoke directly and focally to the role of culture in adolescent development. And yet, as Barbara Rogoff writes, human development is a cultural process. As a biological species, humans are defined in terms of our cultural participation. We are prepared by both our cultural and biological heritage to use language, participate in relationships, how to think, and what we care most about. Evolutionary psychologists Bruce Ellis and David Bjorklund make a similar point about the extraordinarily rapid coevolution in the last 100,000 years of the human's big brain and culture. Biology and culture have fed off each other to shape how different groups of people think, talk, and feel, notions of duty, emotions of disgust and pride, and challenges for the formation of adult identity. I think Schwader, Goodnow, Marcus, and colleagues nailed it in pointing out how our cultural heritage defines the pillars of human development: what is true, beautiful, good, and normal. What is true, beautiful, good, and normal. Those are really powerful words. Yet too often our field has balked because the round forms of culture don't fit well into the square holes of our variable-oriented field. Yes, there's value in looking at culture as a variable or as variables that represent dimensions of culture, but culture is so much, much more. And what I really value about Niobe Wei's work is how often she examines culture not as a variable, but as a main effect. As Clyde Kluckhohn wrote, culture is the water in which we swim, often with little consciousness of it. No wonder it's so hard to see. No wonder it's so hard to get into SRA and SRCD publications. And yet, as Niobe has shown in 6 books, including numerous articles in JRA and Child Development and other publications, culture is also the medium in which humans come of age. A tremendous contribution, and a topic of her talk today, is Niobe's systematic analysis of how cultural notions of gender are a medium shaping thoughts, emotions, and peer relationships about gender. She's drawn on methodical, painstaking longitudinal research with hundreds of youth to unpack the thick levels at which cultural notions of gender influence self and self-expectations. I thought it was sort of fitting that since she's going to talk about boys, that she have a boy introduce her. And in reading Niobe's book, I felt, okay, when I grew up, my friends were giving boxing gloves as a birthday present, and what was the message there? And I don't know if getting an Xbox 360 is sending a different message, but I certainly remember, getting pummeled and knocked, not quite unconscious, but somewhat delirious by those boxing gloves. Niobe just received his doctorate from Harvard University and did a postdoc at Yale. She's a professor of applied psychology at NYU, where she is co-director of the Center for Research on Culture, Development, and Education. She has also been a tremendously productive president of SRA, as we've seen, greatly expanding our communication both within the organization as well as to the public and outside the organization. And just personally, I remember maybe 3-4 years ago, one of my first conversations with Niobe was in a kind of rundown Chinese restaurant outside the train station in Philadelphia, in which her mind got going. And for those of you who know her, she's just a tremendous font, creative font of ideas on the future of SRA, and those of us on Consul and the rest of us have seen that in many ways over the last 2 years. So we're very fortunate today to have Niobe Wei deliver the 2012 SRA Presidential Address.
Okay, you couldn't ask for a better introduction than that. I'm going to now put on my, actually I'll put on my glass in a minute. Today what I want to do is talk to you about what I've learned from listening to boys growing up in the United States over the past 20 years. I began listening to boys and girls in my role as a high school counselor in the late 1980s, and continued listening as a developmental psychologist conducting mixed method studies of social and emotional development of adolescents over the past 2 decades. My research has focused primarily on friendships due to my early experience as a high school counselor, in which I heard boy after boy talk about their friendships, having them, wanting to be closer to particular male friends, and feeling betrayed or feeling betrayed by their closest male friends. I heard this day in and day out. Given our cultural stereotypes about boys, I didn't expect to hear these stories. I thus began a career of examining such relationships throughout adolescence, typically following hundreds of boys over 4 to 5 years during junior high and high school, and examining the ways in which the micro and macro context influence boys' experiences of friendships over time, and that's what I'll be talking about today. What I discovered, as you will hear shortly, and this is the interesting thing for me that I realized only in the past few years, and it's a follow-up with the Franz de Waal talk this morning, by the way, is that a study of boys' friendships is more than simply a study of friendships. It's also a study of stereotypes about gender, sexuality, and race, and how such stereotypes shape boys' lives. It's a study about masculinity and the ways in which conventions of masculinity shape boys' relationships. A study of boys' friendships is also about what it means to be a boy, growing up in a particular historical moment within a particular context. The historical moment from my studies has been the late 20th and early 21st century. And the context for most of my studies has been the United States, although I'll refer to my other studies I'm doing right now in China and India. Finally, a study of boys' friendships illuminates, as do all well-designed studies of human beings, what it means to be human, embedded in context and culture. I'm going to present my research and the research of others who have done closely related work by reading a paper drawn from different parts of my book that recently came out, published by Harvard University Press, entitled Deep Secrets, Boys' Friendships and the Crisis of Connection. For the next hour, I would like you to sit back and listen to what my research and the research of others have revealed about boys, friendships, culture, context, growing up in the United States, and being human more generally. I want to say a side point quickly before I begin to talk about boys in particular. I realized that the last day that the study of gender is a bit like in the state that the study of race was about 15, 20 years ago, when the study of race was only considered sort of relevant if we compared black people and white people. The study of gender is still stuck in that bit of a place like that, where we assume the study of gender is always gender differences. And so what I'm hoping by this talk in part is to encourage the study of gender in the sense of looking at the experience of boys, girls from different contexts, but not necessarily as a comparison. Okay. What I'm going to do is, as I read a lot of quotes because I work with language. That's what I'm fascinated by, how our language reveals our inner and outer worlds. And so I work with language, so you have to see the language. So as I read quotes, I'm going to show them on the overhead, and I want you to read them along with me so you can hear the language. If we had more time, I would unpack each word in that quote, but I'm not going to do it today. I'll just give you the general sense. And for all those who've known me many years, yes, I wear glasses now. Okay. Drink some water first before I begin. This is my book. Okay. It is the middle of June, and the New York City heat is on full blast, making it even hotter in the empty high school classroom where 15-year-old Justin and his interviewer, Jose, sit in the late afternoon. Justin is being interviewed for the second time for our school-based research project on boys' social and emotional development. There is neither an air conditioner nor a fan in the classroom, so Justin, in his baggy jeans and T-shirt, pulls out a notebook from his backpack and begins to fan himself as he listens to Jose begin the interview protocol. The first set of questions is about Justin's friends, and he responds by discussing his network of peers in school. Turning to the topic of close friendships, he says, "My best friend and I love each other. That's it. You have this thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it. It's just a thing that you know that that person is that person, and that is all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes two people can really, really understand each other and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens. It's human nature." Listening to boys, particularly during early and middle adolescence, speak about their male friendships is like reading an old-fashioned romance novel where the female protagonist is describing her passionate feelings for her man. At the edge of manhood, when pressures to conform to gender expectations intensify, boys speak about their male friends, their best friends, with abandon, referring to them as people whom they love. And as Justin says, quote, "This thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it." They tell their interviewers in great detail and with tremendous affect about their best friends with whom they share their deepest secrets and without whom they would feel lost. Set against a culture that perceives boys and men to be, quote unquote, activity-oriented, emotionally illiterate, and interested only in independence, these stories seem surprising. The lone cowboy, the cultural icon of masculinity in the West, and much of the social science research over the past 15 years suggests that what boys want and need most are opportunities for competition and autonomy. Yet over 85% of the hundreds of boys we've interviewed throughout adolescence for the past 2 decades suggest that their closest friendships, especially during early and middle adolescence, share the plot of Love Story more than the plot of The Lord of the Flies. Boys from different walks of life greatly valued their male friendships and saw them as critical components to their emotional well-being, not because their friends were worthy opponents in the competition for manhood, but because they were able to share their thoughts and feelings, their deepest secrets with these friends. Yet when one looks at the research on adolescent boys, discussions of close friendships are almost entirely absent. When male friendships are discussed, they are often relegated to the superficial category of buddies and described as, quote unquote, loose collections of peers that offer very little sharing or emotional support. Male friends are framed as backslapping pals, more interested in playing, competing, and boasting about various types of conquests than in talking together or sharing their lives. These relationships are, in essence, defined by their simplicity rather than by their complexity, emotional nuance, and depth. While these representations of boys' friendships are considered true for all boys, ethnic minority and poor and working class boys, particularly those who are Black and Latino, are assumed to be even less likely than their white peers to have emotionally expressive male friendships. Such boys are often stereotyped, as Howard Stevenson has written about, and the same with Michael Cunningham, to be hyper-masculine and thus unlikely to have friendships that entail much vulnerability. The only boys of color or poor and working class boys who are exempt from these stereotypes are Asian boys. Yet these boys have to contend with an entirely different set of damaging stereotypes that feminize their bodies and their academic achievements. In a recent article for a men's magazine, it's not so recent, about 5-6 years ago, there was an image of an Asian young man, and the title said Asian or gay. So they're making explicit equation that being Asian is being gay. So there was, of course, a huge protest that went on as a result. Now, what's interesting, if you start to unpack the Jeremy Lin phenomenon, how much that may be shifting things. Asian males, like their non-Asian peers, are also stereotyped as being unemotional and inexpressive. While some scholars attribute this emotional stoicism to Asian culture, others see it as a combination of both gender and ethnic norms and assume implicitly that Asian boys are just, if not more, emotionally illiterate as their Black, Latino, and white peers. Yet my research over the past 2 decades and the research of a few others have suggested a very different story about boys and boys' friendships. Today I'm going to describe these findings, why we should care, and what are the implications of these findings for thinking about human development more generally. I will draw specifically from 3 of my longitudinal studies of the social-emotional development of 145 boys growing up in the United States who were followed from early to late adolescence. I've also been following families living in Nanjing, China with Hiro Yoshikawa and Xinyan Chen, and also following another 250 families in New Delhi with my doctoral student Tavishi, who's hopefully sitting out there somewhere. She better be. But I will, Tavishi, are you there? Yes, okay, good. But I won't focus on those findings today. While my studies include standardized surveys, semi-structured interviews, and participant observations, I will only be presenting my findings from semi-structured interviews. But what you have to understand, which most of you do who've been doing this for a long time, is that all these methods feed into each other. So I hang out with kids, I interview kids, we do standardized surveys. The information you get from each source of data informs the interpretation of the other. So they're always feeding into each other. My method of analysis, as I said before, is language-based and explores how language reveals the inner and outer world of the participants. The boys I discuss are primarily African American, Puerto Rican, Dominican American, and Chinese American, and a smaller number of European American boys, and almost all come from poor working class or lower middle class families living in urban areas. Demographically, these boys represent the majority or close to the majority of teenage boys in the United States. According to the recent US Census, approximately 80% of Americans live in urban areas, 70% are poor working class or lower middle class, and 44% of youth under 20 are ethnic or racial minorities. So now let's begin. I'm going to start with the first theme that I'm going to talk about today. Hector says at the age of 14, "I've got 2 best friends, Willie and Brian. Like sometimes when me and Willie argue, me and Brian are real close. Then when me and Brian are not doing so good, me and Willie are real close. It's like circles of love. Sometimes we're all close." Jason says at the age of 15, "My ideal best friend is a close friend who I could say anything to, because sometimes you need to spill your heart out to somebody, and if there's nobody there, then you're going to keep it inside, then you'll have anger. So you need somebody to talk to always." Secret sharing or talking intimately with best friends was how boys defined a best friend, and betrayal of this confidence was the primary cause for terminating a best friendship. Mark says in his freshman year, "My best friend could just tell me anything, and I could tell him anything. Like I always know everything about him. We always chill. Like we don't hide secrets from each other. We tell each other our problems." When asked to explain why he feels close to his best friend, Richard says, quote, "If I'm having problems at home, they'll counsel me. I just trust them with anything, like deep secrets, anything." Eddie, a sophomore, says, "It's like a bond. We keep secrets. Like there's something that's important to me, like I could tell him, and he won't go and make fun of it. Like if my family is having problems or something." And the whole ways in which boys protected each other's vulnerability was a core aspect of the way they were intimate with each other. While boys spoke about loving to play basketball, of course, or video games or other kinds of games or sports, the emphasis with their best friend was, and again, I'm distinguishing between best friends and friends. Best friends was always on talking together and sharing secrets. Sharing secrets was not only a dyadic exchange, though, but also took place in a group. Sean says in his freshman year, "You know, on that Christmas day, my friends and I all slept in this little bed. It was little. We were like squeezing, and then we were listening to this cheap radio. My friend got a cheap radio. We were turning it like a low volume and listening to songs at like 12:30 at night to like 3 in the morning. We were not all listening. We were talking about secrets, and that's how I know my best friends." Boys indicated that the intimacy or sharing of secrets in their friendships is what they liked most about the friendship. Ken, a sophomore, says, We always tell each other everything, and like something happens, I save it for my best friend. In his junior year, he says, "What I like most about my best friend is the connection. It's like, you know how you know somebody for so long you could talk about anything and you won't even think, oh, what are they thinking? You just talk." MJ says what he likes most about his best friend is, yeah, because my best friend is like a second person you could speak to. It's like, see how the kids carry a little teddy bear or whatever, and when they cry, they'll hold it and stuff. So when like you get upset or something, you just walk over to your best friend and he'll loosen you up, whatever. He'll be like, yeah, it's all right, even though it's not. MJ recognizes both the safety that a friend provides, but also the ways in which boys cover over and tell stories they know are not true. And I just have to underscore hundreds and hundreds of quotes like this. The emphasis of showing you these quotes of multiple boys is to reinforce the fact that these are hundreds and hundreds of boys over many, many years that I kept on hearing the same kinds of language. And we're beginning to also hear it in Nanjing, China, by the way. Same language in terms of the meaning of it for boys talking about their best friendships. The content of boys' secrets varied considerably, and the term secrets was oftentimes used interchangeably with problems. Problems were always secrets, but secrets weren't necessarily problems. Mike makes distinctions between secrets when talking about the friends whom he doesn't trust and the friends that he does. I mean, I can like joke around with my friends who are not close, and like if I'm like having trouble in my classes, like if somebody knows the subject better than me, like I'll ask them, like, yeah, it's pretty much like that, not too deep though. I wouldn't tell them like my too secretest things, not too secretive. Yeah, like about a girl or something. I mean, that's the deepest. Nothing deeper than that though. With my best friend, I will tell him my deepest secrets. The content of regular or not too deep secrets range from crushes on girls or girl-related topics. Really, really big secrets or secretist things were almost always related to conflicts in the home, or on rare occasions, coping with disabilities or drug abuse of a family member. Paul admits that it's good to have a best friend because, quote, sometimes like you don't want to tell your family members because it's probably about them, and you just tell your friend, and they'll keep a secret and help you. Boys not only had intimate friendships, but this is the key thing here. They believed that this intimacy was essential for their health and well-being, and they say it explicitly. Stephen says, you need friends to talk to sometimes. You know, like you have nobody to talk to. You don't have a friend, it's hard. You've got to keep things bottled up inside. You might just start crying or whatever. Like if a family member is beating on you or something and you can't tell a friend, you might just go out, just, do drugs, sell drugs, whatever. Alan says in his junior year that he needs, quote, someone to talk to, like you have problems with something, you go talk to him, by the way. If you keep it all to yourself, you go crazy, try to take it out on somebody else. Another boy concurs, saying that without friends, you will go crazy or mad. You'd be lonely all the time, be depressed. You would go wacko. Kai says bluntly, at the age of 14, my friendships are important because you need a friend or else you'd be depressed, you won't be happy, you'd try to kill yourself because then you'll be all alone and no one to talk to. Lee says in his freshman year in response to why friendships are important, he says, if you don't have friends, no, you got no one to tell secrets to. The interviewer says, so what happens then? He says, then it's like you need to keep all the secrets to yourself. The interviewer says, what do you think it'd be like if you didn't have somebody? Lee says, then it's like I always think like bad stuff in my brain because like no one's helping me and I just need to keep all the secrets to myself. I want you to hear a Chinese boy in our study in China at the age of 13 when asked the same question. Okay, and obviously this is translated. If I don't have a friend, I would be crazy. The feeling would be depressing. No one would know what my heart wants to say. Nobody would listen. Then I'd be forced to become crazy. What is striking here is how similar the boys in our study in China sound to our American boys. The boys in my studies know that their across studies know that their intimate friendships are critical for their mental health. We've also detected similar patterns in our survey studies. In his analysis of 400 boys over 3 years, Carlos Santos, a former doctoral student of mine, found using growth curve analysis that increased rates of adherence to masculine norms in friendships, meaning being emotionally stoic, autonomous, and physically tough with others, was positively associated with increased rates of depressive symptoms. In other words, the more boys reported being emotionally stoic, autonomous, and physically tough with their friends, the higher their scores were on depressive symptoms. Tavisha Gupta, who you've all been introduced to, who's sitting in the back there, found a similar patterns among the 350 Chinese boys in our China study. Or the flip way of interpreting the finding is for both Chinese and US boys, expressing feelings with friends and valuing the interdependent nature of the friendship was significantly associated with better mental health. Yet something happens to boys as they enter late adolescence. As boys enter manhood, they do in fact begin to talk less. They start using the phrase, which is very common in the United States at this point, no homo, following any intimate statement about their friends, and they begin to say that they don't have time for their male friendships, even though they continue to express strong desires for having such friendships. In response to a simple question regarding how their friendships have changed since they were freshmen in high school, 2 boys respond and reveal everything about friendships for boys during adolescence. Justin describes, remember Justin from the first quote? He describes in his senior year how his friendships have changed since he was a freshman. Oop, there we go. I don't know, maybe not a lot, but I guess the best friends become close friends, so that's basically the only thing that's changed. It's like best friends become close friends become general friends, and then general friends become acquaintances. So they just, if there's a distance, whether it's, I don't know, natural or whatever, you can say that, but it happens that way. Michael says, like my friendship with my best, in his senior year, my friendship with my best friend is fading, but I'm saying it's still there. But so I mean it's still there because we still do stuff together, but only once in a while. It's sad because he only lives 1 block away from me, and I get to do stuff with him less than I get to do stuff with people who are way further. I'm like, yo, it's like a DJ used his crossfader and started fading it slowly and slowly, and now I'm like halfway through the crossfade. Matthew says, we used to be close as far as always being around each other, obviously talking about his best friend. Now it's just like we're apart. Like as far as like if I need them, they'll still be there. If they need me, I'll be there. But as far as like always being together, we're not as close as we were before. Late adolescence for the boys in my study is a time of disconnection from the relationships that they hold so close to their hearts. Rather than simply being a period of progress, adolescence for these boys is also a period of loss. As their bodies are almost fully grown and their minds are increasingly attuned to cultural messages about manhood and maturity, boys begin to distance themselves from the very relationships that they relied on previously so they wouldn't go wacko. Boys know by late adolescence that their close male friendships, and even in this culture of the United States, even their emotional acuity, put them at risk of being labeled girly, immature, or gay. Thus, rather than focusing on who they are, they become obsessed with who they are not. They are not girls, little boys, or in the case of heterosexual boys, are they gay? In response to a cultural context that links intimacy in male friendships with an age, a sex, and a sexuality, these boys mature into men who are autonomous, emotionally stoic, and isolated. The ages of 16 to 19, however, are not only a period of disconnection for the boys in my study, it is also exactly the period in which the suicide rate for boys in the United States rises dramatically and becomes 5 times the rate of girls, when in early adolescence it is only 3 times the rate of girls, although girls, by the way, are always more likely to attempt suicide. Just as boys during early and middle adolescence predicted, not having friends to share their deepest secrets during late adolescence makes them go wacko. When Justin, a 9th grader who has a close male friend with whom he shares all his secrets, is asked if and why male friendships are important, he explains that then you are not lonely, you need someone to turn to when things are bad. 3 years later, he says in response to the very same question that while he has nothing against gay people, he himself is not gay. He also tells his interviewer that he no longer has any close male friends, although he wouldn't mind having such friendships like the ones he had when he was younger, as he thinks they may make him feel less lonely and perhaps less disconnected from school. Other boys during late adolescence responded similarly. When boys didn't directly discuss this link between sexuality and friendships, they did indirectly with the phrase no homo, a verbal tic that was repeated after every intimate phrase. We're close, no homo. We talk, no homo. It's now actually turned into this sort of bizarre series of humor and jokes, and you can see it on YouTube. And It's all throughout the hallways of high schools. Questions about close male friendships only became questions about sexuality during late adolescence. Yet the striking part of boys' narratives during late adolescence is that while boys repeated the late 20th century equation of close friendships with sexuality, many of them remained explicit about the sadness they felt as a result of the loss of these friends. Guillermo says in his junior year, the interviewer says, "Do you have a closer best friend this year?" "Not really, I think myself. The friend I had, I lost it. That was the only person I could trust, and we talked about everything. When I was down, he used to help me feel better the same I did to him. So I feel pretty lonely and sometimes depressed because I don't have no one to go out with, no one to speak on the phone, no one to tell my secrets or to help me solve my problems. Why don't you think you have somebody? Because I think it will never be the same, you know. I heard this so many times. I think that when you have a real friend and you lost it, I don't think you find another one like him. That's the point of view I have. I tried to look for a person, but it's not that easy." Guillermo discusses the loss of his close male friends, but remains explicit about his sadness over the loss. So what's interesting here, and I won't go on about it, but what's interesting here is he's actually resisting a kind of mainstream masculinity by articulating the sadness over the loss, because there was certainly another theme, which you'll hear about, of the I don't care theme. Victor says in his junior year that he doesn't have a best friend this year, but he would like one. "No, I don't say I would, because I feel that a friend is going to be there for you and he'll support you and stuff like that, whether they're good or bad times. You can share with him, you could share your feelings with him, your true feelings. That's why I don't think I have any real close friends. I mean, things can travel around in a school and things would go around and the story would change from person to person. Yeah, basically, I hate it. Because, I wouldn't mind talking to somebody my age, that I can relate to him on a different basis." Like Guillermo, Victor longs to find the type of intimate male friend that he had earlier, but fears of betrayal prevent him from continuing to pursue this possibility. In their groundbreaking work on adolescent girls, Carol Gilligan and Lynn Michael Brown find a similar loss among girls, but at an earlier age. In their longitudinal studies of hundreds of girls, they find that girls during late childhood, 8 to 11, are able to speak freely and honestly in their relationships. Yet on the brink of adolescence, girls lose this ability to speak their minds and hearts and become increasingly disconnected from their real thoughts and feelings. They find that girls who were once outspoken become lost in a world of I don't know and forget what they used to know about themselves and their relational worlds. Girls enter the world of womanhood, a world that encourages the sacrificing of one's own needs to the needs of others, and lose their ability to speak freely. My studies suggest that boys too experience a loss, but their loss happens in late adolescence. Boys enter their teenage years with a tremendous willingness and ability to engage in intimate male friendships, despite the cultural dictates that discourage such behavior, and that's a critical aspect of the finding. Remember, middle school is a heightened period of homophobia, and they're having these friendships in the midst of that context. Yet as they enter manhood, they begin to lose their way. Their emotionally sensitive and astute voices become fearful and wary. Words such as love, so pervasive in their interviews during early and middle adolescence, give way to expressions of sadness, anger, frustration, or simply of not caring any longer. In our analysis of emotion words in the boys' interviews, we counted emotion words. Throughout adolescence, we see a dramatic decline in the use of vulnerable words such as love and sadness, and an increase in the words related to anger and frustration as boys grow older, or we simply see a decrease in emotion words altogether. The intimacy in boys' friendships, as well as the loss of such intimacy, is evident not only in my studies, but in studies of boys and men over the past century. In the early 20th century, in the first decade, around 1904, a survey study was conducted of 2,500 youth in the state of Illinois. The researchers concluded that intimate or secret-sharing friendships were common among both boys and girls and were critical to their mental health. Harry Stack Sullivan, as everyone knows, found the same pattern in his clinical work with pre-adolescent boys in the middle part of the 20th century. And more recently, researchers such as Margarita Izmitia and her colleagues and Stephen Frosch and his colleagues have also noted the intimacy in boys' friendships. Studies of adult male friendships suggest, furthermore, that the loss that I heard in my studies is common among men. In a study of hundreds of men, Stuart Miller concludes that, quote unquote, most men secretly cherish the memories of the close male friendships they had when they were younger. And if you look at popular culture and look at the movie Stand By Me, is literally an enactment of this theme, where Richard Dreyfuss is narrating. Do you remember the film? It came out in the mid-'80s. It's narrating this loss of having friendships and losing friendships during adolescence. Yet despite over a century of findings underscoring the intimate nature of boys' friendships, we continue to frame boys as activity-oriented and emotionally illiterate, and continue to devalue or demean those very emotional qualities associated with being female and gay and with not going wacko, according to the boys. We continue to see boys and men as gender stereotypes and as different from girls and women in their social and emotional needs and desires, rather than as humans with the same social emotional needs and capacities as girls and women. The relevant questions aren't how to teach social emotional skills to boys. The question are what fosters boys' abilities to have intimate male friendships? Why do boys lose their friendships, or at least lose trust in their other boys as they grow older? And finally, why are we not paying attention to what the boys are telling us? But before I offer answers to these questions, let me remind you of why we should care about friendships in the first place. Decades of research, many of you sitting here, which is such a pleasure for me to talk about this with the already converted. Decades of research with children and adolescents, including our own survey-based research, has revealed that close friendships are linked with all kinds of positive outcomes, such as emotional and physical well-being, as well as academic achievement. Many of you sitting here have done this research, and it has repeatedly underscored why we should care about friendships. Adolescents without close friendships are at risk of depression, suicide, dropping out of school, early pregnancy, drug use, and gang membership. In our survey studies in the US and in China, we find that support from close friends is more predictive of psychological well-being and academic performance than support from parents. Among adult men and women, researchers have consistently found that those who have close friendships or strong social support networks are less prone to depression, less likely to get physical illnesses, and more likely to live longer lives. Sociologist Rebecca Adams finds that friendships among adults are more important than family relationships in predicting psychological health over the lifespan, and clearly in that she's assuming that the friendships are non-familial, which is another topic. Similarly, friendships have been found to be more predictive of physical health than spouses. In a 6-year study of 736 middle-aged men, attachment to a single person, almost always a spouse, did not lower the risk of heart attack and fatal coronary heart disease, whereas having a strong social support network did. Smoking was the only risk factor comparable to a lack of social support. Researchers also find that people with strong social support networks are less likely than others to get colds and other common illnesses and are at less risk of death. And social support networks, if you see how it's actually assessed, it's really just looking at how many friends do you have or what's your network of friendships. In a study of 30 industrialized countries, epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett conclude that the two most important factors in 30 industrialized countries, the two most important factors determining the health and well-being of people living in the countries are social status and friendships. Those who lack friendships and those who have low social status are at greatest risk for health problems and death. And one thing that's fascinating is they find that the larger the income inequality in the country, the lower rates of close friendships. Among the rich and the poor, by the way, not just among the poor. So income inequality, they see an association between basically the climate of as Franz de Waal talked about, the social climate being more negative. In a meta-analysis of over 148 studies that examine the link between social relationships and the risk of death, researchers recently concluded that individuals with strong social relationships have a 92% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with weak social relationships. The risk of death for those with poor social relationships are comparable with well-established risk factors for death, such as smoking and alcohol consumption, and exceed the influence of other risk factors, such as physical inactivity and obesity. This point underscores the fact that friendships are not simply a feel-good issue, they are a life or death issue. Underscoring the importance of best friendships in particular, William Bukowski, who's sitting out here, and his colleagues find in their daily diary study with 5th and 6th graders that having a best friend present during a negative experience significantly buffered the effect of the negativity on cortisol levels and global self-worth. Now you have to follow me, it's a little complicated. When a best friend was not present, there was a significant increase in cortisol and a significant decrease in global self-worth as the negativity of the experience increased. When a best friend was present, there was less change in cortisol and global self-worth due to the negativity of the experience. This effect was strikingly not evidence for those in the presence of friends who are not close. So they only found the effect in the presence of best friends, not in the presence of friends. And I wanted to just show you a quick graph of that. If you look at the dark, you can't tell. The one that's going up is the line where the best friend was not present. The cortisol level's going up when they're present during a negative experience, and the one that's flat is when they're in the presence of their best friend during a negative experience. In another experiment showing the importance of having friendships, social psychologist Kent Harbour and others find that perceptions of geographical slant are significantly shaped by the proximity of a friend. And I'll tell you in a second why this is completely relevant to everybody sitting here. In their experimental design, the researchers asked college students to stand at the base of a hill while carrying a weighted backpack and to estimate the steepness of the hill, okay? It was done at UVA. They're standing at the base of a hill. They're having to estimate the steepness of the hill with a weighted backpack. Some participants stood next to close friends whom they had known a long time. Some stood next to friends they had not known for long, and the rest stood alone during the exercise. The students who stood with friends gave significantly lower estimates of the steepness of the hill than those who stood alone. And get this, furthermore, the longer the close friends had known each other, the less steep the hill appeared to the participants involved in the study. And that's been repeated many, many times. This is standing next to a best friend, okay? The longer they've known each other, the less steep the hill looked. So if you think about the implications, the less difficult the world looks, right? Standing next to a best friend. In another similar study where college students were asked to simply recall a positive social relationship, a neutral one and a negative one, immediately before estimating the steepness of a hill, they found that those who simply recalled a positive social relationship estimated the hill to be less steep than those who recalled a neutral or a negative one. In addition, the closer the participant felt to the person they were recalling in the positive relationship, the less steep the hill appeared. In other words, the world looks less difficult when standing next to or even recalling a close friend. And the striking thing, they found that with the cry of a baby. A cry of a baby sounds less stressful when you're with your best friend than when you're not with your best friend. In sum, decades of research have revealed the critical nature of close friendships for our health and well-being, and thus why the loss of such relationships should be of great concern to us all. Okay, so now back to the questions raised by my research findings. The first question is, how are boys able to have intimate friendships when they live in such a rigidly gendered culture where the boy code and the cool pose dominate? The answers lie, as Yuri Bronfenbrenner pointed out decades ago, in the micro and macro context of boys' lives, including parent-child relationships, the social dynamics in schools, and the ethnic communities of the boys themselves. These factors are, of course, not the only ones that foster boys' social-emotional skills, but they are the ones that appear to distinguish those boys in my studies who had intimate male friendships during early and middle adolescence or continued to have them throughout adolescence from those who didn't. And this is getting at the variability in the sample, obviously. Obviously, there was variability, so the question is what predicted the variability? We found that those adolescents who reported having at least one parent who was emotionally engaged with them and offered a safe space for their sons to talk freely about their thoughts and feelings were often the adolescents who had intimate male friendships. This is, of course, consistent entirely with attachment theory, including Joe Allen's research that reveals a significant link between security of attachment with parents and friendship quality during adolescence. And since parents are socialized into a culture in which mothers are considered the carriers of emotion and emotional talk, and fathers are not, we found, unsurprisingly, that it is typically the mothers who are offering the space for boys to stay connected to and express their thoughts and feelings. Our survey data with a middle school sample of 400 boys collected as part of my work with Diane Hughes at New York University supports this qualitative finding and find these patterns both concurrently and prospectively. Boys' reports of high levels of mother support in 6th grade and an increase in mother support from 6th to 8th grade predicted an increase in boys' reports of emotional expression in their friendships from 6th to 8th grade. In addition to parent-child relationships, the social dynamics at school fostered boys' intimate friendships. The boys in my studies who were most likely to have, now this is a little tricky, so follow, who were most likely to have intimate or secret sharing male friendships were those who had the most social power with their peers in school. Social power among peers was acquired through numerous routes, including the familiar ones, such as being athletic, tall, conventionally good-looking, and having a good sense of humor. Having these attributes resulted in greater social power that in turn appeared to lead to greater freedom to bend the rules of the boy code. Psychologist Lynn Michael Brown and her colleagues have noted a similar pattern in their studies of boys, concluding, quote, "The good news for parents," and she's saying that facetiously, clearly, "the good news for parents is that being successful at sports not only protects a boy from being called gay, but also gives him permission to do well academically, show sensitivity, and stick up for kids who are bullied." Boys who succeeded in sports and who appeared manly in our studies did not seem to feel as much pressure as the other boys to prove their masculinity or their heterosexuality. In addition to these more traditional routes to social power, there were other routes contingent on race, ethnicity, immigrant status, and sexual orientation, of course, of the boys themselves, and the stereotypes associated with each of these social categories. In the US culture, where masculinity is raced, classed, sexualized, as well as given a nationality, Black and Latino boys are considered more masculine than white or Chinese boys, and working class boys are perceived as more masculine than middle or upper class boys. Furthermore, looking American, baseball cap, untucked shirt, untied Nikes. I used to say untied athletic shoes, and the teenagers would say, "Athletic shoes? What are you talking about?" And then I'd say, "How about sneakers?" No. Okay, untied Nikes. Looking American is perceived as more masculine than looking like an immigrant, i.e. button-up shirts, tucked-in shirt, and tied shoes. Similarly, looking straight, tell me what looking straight looks like. It looks exactly like looking American, right? Baseball cap, untucked shirt, untied Nikes, right? Is the same as looking American, is perceived as more masculine than looking gay, stereotypically, of course, i.e. skinny jeans and tight shirts. The look of masculinity, which is based on a set of stereotypes about race, ethnicity, social class, and nationality, and sexual orientation, is part of the same embedded set of masculine conventions that equates emotional stoicism and autonomy with being a real man. Within the context of my studies, the boys who had the look of masculinity were considered the most cool, according to their peers, were the Puerto Rican boys, and that's obviously specific to the context I've been in. These were the boys who the non-Puerto Rican teens, particularly the Dominican American, Chinese American, and European American teenagers in our studies, wanted to be. The Puerto Rican boys were also the most likely to have intimate male friendships and speak in emotionally attuned ways. In his analysis of our survey data, Carlos Santos finds that Puerto Rican boys are, in fact, the most likely to have intimate male friendships when compared with their African American, Chinese American, European American, and Dominican American. Reasons for the social clout of the Puerto Ricans were not only due to their American look and status versus being an immigrant, they were also given such clout because, according to the teens, they have between skin tone and hair, which is neither stereotypically black nor white, and their cool language, Spanish versus Chinese or other languages, music and style. This clout made it easier for the Puerto Ricans to have the types of friendships that boys want, but that are often discouraged as feminine, gay, or immature. A third set of factors that appeared to foster the intimacy and the friendships of boys were the cultural values, of course, held in these ethnic communities. Latino boys, for example, share a pan-ethnic culture that has a long tradition of valuing emotional expression and friendships. From the writing of Junot Diaz to the poetry of Pablo Neruda, it is obvious that many Spanish-speaking cultures value the type of relationships that the Latino boys had in my studies. Yet this is true with all the boys. Like their Latino brothers, African-American boys also share a culture where brotherhood and friendships are strongly valued. Scholars have argued that it is, in fact, European-American culture that is dispassionate, aloof, stoic, and independent, and not reflective of the traditional values of black people. The cool pose of black boys in this view signifies a distrust of white culture and not an inherently quality of black culture. Chinese American youth also share a culture with other Chinese people with a long history of valuing intimate friendships. One sees evidences in the teachings of Confucius as well as in traditional Chinese poetry. Finally, European American boys, of course, are also embedded in a culture that has a tradition of valuing friendships from philosophers, poets, and writers such as Homer, Aristotle, Shakespeare, and Twain. In sum, the black, Latino, Asian, and white boys in my studies were all part of ethnic communities that have long traditions of valuing male friendships, and thus, in some respect, the prevalence of close male friendships was not surprising. Yet by late adolescence, it became increasingly difficult across the board, if not impossible, for the boys to maintain these male friendships and or to trust their male friends, even though they continued to want these intimate friendships. And by the way, their desire for close male friendships was expressed regardless of the romantic relationship status. Thus, the next set of questions is, why do boys lose their friendship and or their sense of trust with their male friends? And I'm making that point to make the point that not all boys were losing their friendships in the same way, but you definitely saw a decline in trust and certainly in emotional language. The reason for boys' losses during late adolescence can be divided into thin and thick culture explanations, and I'm borrowing from Clifford Geertz's Thin and Thick. Thin culture explanations repeat narratives that are familiar to many and only skim the surface. When boys are asked directly about the loss of trust in friendships, they repeat well-worn narratives about why friendships disappear. Having girlfriends, busy work and school schedules, different interests, and changes in schools and neighborhoods were risk-free reasons for the loss of friendship and trust. The boys invoke these excuses freely, but not without expressing frustration, sadness, and anger at their losses, and a persistent wish to regain what they had earlier in their development. Thick culture explanations for the loss of trust in close friendships among boys focus on conventions of masculinity that emphasize autonomy and emotional stoicism, as well as the homophobia and sexism that discourage such friendships among boys and men in the United States in the first place. Thick culture explanations also draw attention to the larger pattern of decline in social connectedness and empathy over the past 30 years or so. In 1985, according to a nationwide survey study, the modal number of close friendships that adults had was 3, while in 2004, the modal number of friendships was 0, with almost half the population now reporting that they discuss important matters with either no one or with only one person. In a series of studies of college students since 1980, researchers report that there have been a 40% decline in empathy, or in the amount of time that college students spend thinking about other people's feelings, with the biggest drop occurring after the year, what do you imagine it is? After the year 2000. Dozens of other studies have reported similar findings. According to the social scientists, Americans are becoming increasingly disconnected and less empathic. Many of us appear to be facing the same crisis of connection that boys experience as they enter manhood. And finally, thick cultural explanations of boys' losses during late adolescence examine an obvious culprit, and that is our constructions of maturity. Despite the decades upon decades of work on the importance of connectedness for many of you sitting here, the mainstream perception continues to be that autonomy is the essential component of maturity. One sees evidence of this perception in newspaper and journal articles on adolescence. You see it almost on a daily basis. Adolescence is defined as becoming independent and finding their identity. Okay? So it's about the emphasis on autonomy. Mohammed says in his junior year, quote, "But I don't know. Recently, I kind of changed something, not that much, but, I feel like there's no need to. I could keep my feelings to myself. I'm mature enough." Interpreting a desire to share his feelings as a sign of immaturity, Mohammed shuts down. He understands implicitly that there are consequences to becoming mature. Other boys knew these consequences as well, as they explicitly linked maturity and isolation, saying things like, "Now I'm a man. I need to take care of myself and not rely on others." One only needs to ask the question, as one boy did, of what would it mean for us to define manhood and maturity as the ability to have mutually supportive relationships, including friendships, to underscore how far we are from valuing our social skills and our relationships more generally. These thick cultural explanations for boys' losses during adolescence allow us to see beneath the surface, but they don't explain why we have ignored over a century of research that reveal the intimate nature of boys' friendships and their acute emotional and social capacities. In a world where we mostly believe what lights up on an fMRI scan, where thinking and feeling are separated and given a sex and a sexuality, where we use the same word for our 750 Facebook friends and for our 1 or 2 genuine close friends, it is not surprising that we aren't able to see that what boys have in their friendships may not be the same thing as what they want in these relationships. Or that while boys may report lower reports of intimacy in their friendships than girls, they may still have emotionally intimate male friendships. Or that while our gender stereotypes may capture an element of boys' experiences, it does not capture the full picture. We have not paid much attention to what boys are saying and doing in their closest male friendships because we do not believe that boys are, by nature, interested in these types of relationships. Yet if we look back in time in the United States or look at other cultures, this argument about boys' nature falls apart. According to social historians, emotionally intimate friendships among American men were highly valued and very public in the 19th century and earlier. Get this. Honeymoons in the 19th century America involved bringing best friends along for the trip. Anthropologists furthermore find that intimate friendships are strongly valued elsewhere. In southern Ghana, same-sex best friends go through a marriage ceremony similar to that performed for husbands and wives. In Cameroon, adults pressure their children to find a best friend, much in the same way that American parents pressure their adult children to find a romantic partner. In China, at least until the late 1990s, and in other Eastern and Middle Eastern countries, heterosexual men hold hands with their best friends and regularly rely on them for emotional support. The Lakotas, a Native American tribe, have a long tradition of emotionally intimate friendships, where the emphasis for Indian men was on a close emotional bond. It is only our modern American culture and other cultures like that that boys and men's desire for emotionally intimate male friendships is dismissed as a female, gay, and youthful proclivity. The cultured natures of our beliefs about the nature of boys is underscored in Lisa Elliott's book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain. Elliott, a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, disputes numerous claims about sex differences in emotion and cognition. Calling on years of research and her own work in the field of neuroplasticity, it's a fascinating field, Elliott says, quote, "Infant brains are so malleable that small differences at birth become amplified over time, as parents, teachers, peers, and the culture at large unwittingly reinforce gender stereotypes. Girls are not naturally more empathic than boys. They are simply just allowed to express their feelings more," unquote. Although Elliott doesn't acknowledge the fact that boys do, in fact, express their feelings, she draws attention to the ways in which we make our stereotypes about girls and boys into what is naturally rather than what ought not to be culturally. What are the implications? If we take what boys tell us about their friendships seriously, if we take their words at face value, if we take into account what we have learned over the past century regarding boys and men's friendships, we must begin to re-examine our understanding of what it means to be male, as well as what it means to be human. And that is, in fact, what a growing group of natural and social scientists are doing in what David Brooks from the New York Times refers to as the new humanism, emerging in the sciences, that underscore our empathic, cooperative, and social nature. The previous emphasis on competition and aggression as defining attributes of humans is now widely challenged by developmental psychologists like Michael Tomasello and evolutionary anthropologists like Sarah Hrdy, with primatologist Franz de Waal stating that, quote, "We need a complete reassessment of our assumptions about human nature to take into account this new and not so new research." The fact that we are social beings and truly care about what others think and feel is the reason why, even according to Charles Darwin, we have thrived as a species. We want to cooperate. We want to have close friendships. Yet the conceptions of manhood and maturity in the United States and elsewhere rest on valuing emotional stoicism and autonomy almost exclusively. Those of us from the United States and in many other places tell our children, particularly as they reach late adolescence, that they must not only separate from their parents, but also from their teenage peers and move toward independence. We tell our children to think for themselves and not worry about what others think or feel. In other words, we foster ways of being that are not natural and do not bring about psychological or physical health for boys or girls, men or women. When asked what it would like to be a girl, Andy at the age of 16 says, quote, "It might be nice to be a girl because then you wouldn't have to be emotionless," unquote. American culture, in other words, fosters the crisis of connection that the boys in my studies appear to face in late adolescence, and the crisis of connection that many of us appear to be facing in the early 21st century. If we look outside of the United States, particularly in school settings, however, we begin to see something different. Countries such as Norway and Canada and I love the fact we're in Canada right now. Canada's on the cutting edge of this, are changing the ways they school children to address their own crisis of connection. After 3 teenage victims of bullying committed suicide in 1983, a long time ago, Norway began a campaign to build children's social and emotional skills and thus decrease incidents of bullying. Professionals of all kinds were trained to identify and respond to acts of bullying, while students at all grade levels participated in weekly conversations about conflicts and friendships. So it wasn't simply focused on bullying, it was focused on fostering healthy friendships. A quasi-experimental study was conducted on 2,500 children from 42 elementary and middle schools to determine the effects of this large-scale intervention. I'm talking about Norway here. The results indicated that the rates of bullying dropped by half, and stealing and cheating declined during the 2-year period after the program began. Furthermore, significant improvements were detected in the social climate of the class, as reflected in students' reports of increased satisfaction with school life and schoolwork, improved order and discipline at school, and more positive social relationships. And the key intervention in school was actually having a space in which to talk about conflict, right, within friendships and talking about friendships. Canada has also recently implemented a program called the Roots of Empathy in elementary schools across Canada. The program, created by Mary Gordon, brings babies and parents into the classroom on a monthly basis for an entire year to foster empathy among school children. Research on this program has found that it significantly reduces bullying and aggression in school and enhances school curriculum, school engagement. And it's a fascinating, this program has been running since the early 1980s. It became a national program in different districts across Canada in 1996, and it's growing. Psychologists Susan Engel and Marlene Sandstrom argue we need to revise how we think about the function of schooling so that we teach kindness, and I would also add friendships, along with algebra and history. According to the boys in my studies, however, we do not need to teach students such skills. That's what we oftentimes don't get as adults. As they already have these skills, we need to foster their development. In conclusion, what would it mean for us to let boys be boys by fostering their natural empathic abilities and their intimate friendships? What would it mean to define maturity as having emotionally supportive relationships? What would it mean to value the very skills that have been stereotypically associated with girls, women, and gay boys? What would it mean to make it cool to care? Social and natural science research has already given us the answers. If we were to value a full range of relationships, a biodiversity of sorts, and that being emotionally literate, and invested in relationships is not a girl thing or a gay thing or even a childish thing, but an inherent part of being human, we would, according to the research, have better psychological and physical health, better academic outcomes, less bullying in and out of schools, less violence, better marriages, better friendships, stronger communities, and longer lives. The boys in my studies seem to know this, but we as adults seem to have forgotten. If we listen closely, however, to both boys and girls during adolescence, we will begin to remember what we knew all along. What makes us human is our ability to deeply connect with others, and we must figure out ways to strengthen these critical life skills in and out of school. Then perhaps growing up might become, in fact, good for our health, even for those growing up in the United States. Thank you. I want to show. First of all, I want to thank the National Science Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and New York University for all their support over many decades. I want to show you a clip of a YouTube clip. I was blessed enough to be interviewed on my book in the Today Show, and as part of a preempt, they interviewed 3 teenage boys. These are not teenage boys in my study, by the way. They interviewed 3 teenage boys, and I want you to hear them.
What are the rules? I mean, I guess it's different for every set of friends, you know.
Men aren't really supposed to show emotion as much.
Always stay with your friends, you know. The guy could never leave a guy behind for a girl.
You can't be too flamboyant.
You can't really share things that are too personal.
Never telling each other.
Being too effeminate, relating too much to women is kind of a no-no. Yeah, that's not my personal views, but that's part of the guy code.
2, 3 best friends my whole life, and I wouldn't say that we lost friendship. We just don't talk about certain things that we used to talk about.
There was a slump in high school where I kind of distanced myself from my friends. Not purposefully, but it just something that happened.
They don't say they miss me, they just say, where have you been? You haven't been here so long, I haven't seen you.
My younger self was a more open person, and I was more able to express feelings and emotions, whereas now it's sort of like there's some sort of rule that's not what grown men should do.
Guys stay away from expressing themselves because it puts them in a category of gay or girly when it's not really, and we just stay away from that.
We're kind of asked to be the individual, the stoic individual, who can sustain themselves and doesn't need really other people to rely on for emotional support or any kind of support, really.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. We're going to transition. I feel so honored that I could share my work with all of you. We're going to transition now to something very exciting. I'm going to step down as being president and introduce our new president for SRA. His name is Stephen Russell. He is a professor in the Family Studies and Human Development program at University of Arizona. He's also the Fitch Nesbitt Endowed Chair and Director of the Francis McClellan Institute at University of Arizona. He's a close friend of mine and a wonderful, and I know for a fact from listening to the reports of his students, he's a wonderful mentor, teacher, scholar, and friend. His research, it's a wide variety of research topics on cultural differences in parent-child relationships, and he just came out with a fabulous edited book on Asian American families. He also looks at the impact of family economic stress on parent-child relationships, and he also looks at sexual minority youth and the risks and protective factors in their lives, and has a wonderful new grant with lots of money looking at those factors. So I'd like to, we have this ritual here. We have a ritual. We have a cultural ritual here. I'd like to pass the presidency over to Stephen Russell, and he gets a gavel. So here comes Stephen.
Okay, you'll sit there. Well, thank you. You didn't come to hear me. I'll be quick. But I do want to say that the first thing I want to do is acknowledge all of our gratitude and debts to the people that came before us. And first to say thank you to Reed, who's been a terrific mentor to me personally and to all of us. And for those of you who don't know, this is a simplistic way to think about it, but Reed created the organizational foundation and infrastructure that allows us to do what we do at SRA. And he helped us weather the worst some of the worst economic, not all, but not the only time, but some of the worst economic times in the history of SRA. And then we're indebted to Niobe for her leadership in the development and growth of SRA. We're bigger than we've ever been. We seem to be getting bigger. That's very exciting. So I'm honored to lead SRA at this time. It's a very exciting time. We have an exciting new strategic plan. We have new opportunities for member engagement. Talk to me, talk to John Schulenberg, our president-elect. And we have a renewed mission. And if you haven't, it was introduced last night. You've read it online, I hope. Please check it out. We've been specific and explicit for the first time about naming our values. We value young people. We value research as the foundation for the way that we think about how we engage with young people in communities and through policy and practice. And we value diversity. We value diversity among ourselves as scholars and in the scholarship that we do. So finally, just a little bit about me in thinking about this role. I made a commitment to myself when I was beginning my own professional career to think about the ways that social justice would be relevant in my scholarship. And I'm using that word very inclusively. And one of the great opportunities that I inherit from Niobe was her idea that our meetings could be themed, and that we would, the invited program for our biennial conferences could have a theme. So I hope you'll join me in Austin, Texas in 2014 for a conference that will be focused on social justice. Our friends Connie Flanagan and Dan Hart will lead us in ways that we consider the equities and the urgencies in what, how, and for whom we do research on adolescence. So please join me now in a reception to honor past President Way and all of the leadership of SRA. Thank you.